worse than death. That's how Benjamin Rush described compliance with the Tea Act passed May 10th, 1773. For the Revolutionaries, it wasn't really about the tea itself. It wasn't even about the amount of the tax. It was about power. It was the principle that the British Parliament could tax them without their consent and submission, even to a trifling sum of 3 pence per pound, meant surrender. And that was the kind of tea they'd never drink. So on this episode, we're going to break the lie wide open. The Tea Act wasn't about cost or price. It was a test of obedience. And the revolutionaries chose resistance. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, May 9th, 2025. And the founders, the old revolutionaries, they openly mocked the idea that opposition to the Tea Act, including the Tea Parties in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and elsewhere, was about the price, the cost of the tax, the amount of the tax. A young Alexander Hamilton addressed this claim in December of 1774. He said, "What then is the subject of our controversy with the mother country? What can actuate those men," he wrote, "who labor to delude any of us into an opinion that the object of contention between the parent state and the colonies is only 3 pence duty upon tea?" And then once he asked that essential question, basically it was rhetorical for him there, he didn't hold back on the answer. He said the Parliament claims a right to tax us in all cases whatsoever. Its late acts are in virtue of that claim. How ridiculous, he wrote, how ridiculous then is it to affirm that we are quarreling for the trifling sum of 3 pence a pound on tea, when it is evidently the principle against which we contend. And so, with that as our foundation here, we have to understand what that principle was all about. And to do that, we've got to go back a few years to 1763. And History.com describes it like this. In 1763, the British Empire emerged as the victor of the 7 Years' War. Although the victory greatly expanded the empire's imperial holdings, it also left it with a massive national debt. And the British government looked to its North American colonies as an untapped source of revenue. Without a doubt, they did do that. And in 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act. We are very familiar with that one, the first direct internal tax that it had ever levied on the colonies. And we know how the response to the Stamp Act went down: widespread noncompliance and resistance. The people's nullification of the Stamp Act led to its repeal in March of 1766, but the British didn't want to give up their claim to power. They didn't want the colonies to think that they could get away with whatever they wanted. They were just kind of doing it under political considerations, and at the same time they passed the Declaratory Act of 1766, which claimed unlimited power. It claimed power specifically over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. I covered that law and its impact throughout the Revolution, those 15 or so years before the War for Independence, and started in 1775, in an episode, The Forgotten Law That Caused the American Revolution. That will be linked to in the show notes for this episode. I do encourage you to check that one out. But anyways, let's get back to it. Because the British still wanted to use that power, and that's why they passed the Declaratory Act, because they wanted to set the stage to do something later on when they could pull it off. Well, J.L. Bell explains a little bit, just briefly here, the chain of events that followed. So in 1767, he writes, London instituted the Townshend duties. Once again, the colonies responded with non-importation, and those taxes were repealed in 1770. Except for one. They kept one of them, a tax on tea, and they did it on purpose, as we'll hear, because they wanted to make sure, again, that the colonies did not think that the power to tax was being given up. So they kept these on there. And he said, thus, by 1773, a wide swath of Americans were steeped in the belief that any tax levied by Parliament without local approval was despotic, and that the Tea Act was just the latest step in an attempt to oppress them. And David Ramsay's 1789 publication, his History of the American Revolution, which was pretty widely popular when it was printed first, it told pretty much the same story. And Ramsay put it like this: for 10 years, there had now been but little intermission to the disputes between Great Britain and her colonies. Their respective claims had never been compromised on middle ground. And he continued, the calm which followed the repeal of the Stamp Act, because everything seemed cool for about a year or so there, was in a few months disturbed by the Revenue Act of the year 1767. The tranquility which followed the repeal of 5/6 of that act in the year 1770 was nothing more than a truce. So there was still a conflict, but the conflict died down and they still kept that 1/6 of the act. That was the tax on tea, just 3 pence per pound, not a huge deal. Ramsay explained it like this: when the duties which had been laid on glass, paper, and painters' colors were taken off, a respectable minority in Parliament contended that the duty on tea should also be removed. But they didn't want to do that. He said to this it was replied, quote, that as the Americans denied the legality of taxing them, a total repeal would be a virtual acquiescence in their claims. So that was the mentality in much of Parliament, that because those uppity colonists were claiming that we don't have the right to do this, if we go along and even make it look like that, they're going to think that that's the case, even though they already thought that that was the case. Anyways, they didn't want to look like they were giving in to their claims. And Ramsay continued, and that in order to preserve the rights of the mother country, it was necessary to retain the preamble and at least one of the taxed articles. And that's what they kept, the tax on tea. And they were not hiding this at all. They said it out loud. Repealing the tax on tea would admit that the colonies were right. And he said this is again from David Ramsay, as the Parliament thought fit to retain the tax on tea for an evidence of the right of taxation, the Americans in like manner to be consistent with themselves in denying that right, discontinued the importation of that commodity. So they stayed solid on it and they started non-importation on the tea. And as Ramsay explained, this kind of kept an uneasy peace, a truce, a balance of sorts for a few years. He said, while there was no attempt to introduce tea into the colonies against this declared sense of the inhabitants, those opposing claims were in no danger of collision. So as long as the British didn't try to force the issue, then everything was going to be cool. So by Valentine's Day 1773, Benjamin Franklin, in a letter to his son William, pointed out that the boycott was having massive impact. He wrote, the continued refusal of North America to take tea from hence has brought infinite distress on the company. That, of course, is the East India Company. He continued, they imported great quantities in faith that that agreement could not hold. So they had this mentality in the East India Company that despite non-importation agreements, those things weren't going to last. So they brought a bunch of inventory to London for public auction to be shipped eventually to the colonies. And that wasn't playing out. And they were stuck with a lot of inventory on hand. And as a result, as Franklin points out here, now they can neither pay their debts nor dividends. Their stock has sunk to the annihilating near 3 millions of their property. And this kicker, government will lose its 400,000 pounds a year while their teas lie on hand. Now, an important point to understand, there was a logistical process that went down before passage of the Tea Act in 1773. The East India Company was not authorized to ship direct. You couldn't place an order in North Carolina or in Boston or anywhere else in the colonies with the East India Company and have them shipped to you over there, even if you have different merchants handling it at your port. East India had to ship to England, to London, to sell their stuff at public auctions. There was a tax there. Then you, of course, had middlemen and shipping and all that, and exporters. And then that was an extra cost. And then they took it to the colonies, and then that was where the tea tax, the 3 pence on pound, 3 pence per pound. So the Tea Act in and of itself actually didn't add a tax. The tea tax was from the Townshend Acts of 1770. And much of this changed on May 10th, 1773, at least the logistical part, with passage of the Tea Act, where what they did, instead of trying to add a new tax or change the tax, what they ended up just doing was giving the East India Company a special deal. Here, a little piece from the act itself. To export such tea to any of the British colonies or plantations in America, or to foreign parts discharged from the payment of any customs or duties whatsoever. So they were able to kind of get around that process of having to first go to London and pay that tax, and then have middlemen ship it. And then you have the 3 pence tax from the Townshend Acts. So you were just left with the direct shipping and the trifling sum of 3 pence a pound on tea. Now, on paper, that probably sounded really great. If you think about it, you want less regulation, less rules about what everyone can do. So you'd have no more British tax on that side, no more middlemen, lower prices for the people. But that was the whole point. They wanted to use lower prices as a tool to manipulate the people into complying with their tax, to assert their power to tax, or to, well, engage in any power, whatever, whatsoever, in all cases whatsoever of the colonies from the Declaratory Act. And that's really what Lord North admitted. And this is from a footnote, an important footnote in Benjamin Franklin's Volume 6. Lord North, this wasn't written by Franklin. This was from the editor, and we do have some quotes here as well. Lord North avowed the object of retaining this 3-penny tax to be for the purpose of asserting and maintaining the right of Parliament to tax the colonies. He said that, quote, he even wished to have repealed the whole if it could have been done without giving up that absolute right, and that he should, to the last hour of his life, contend for taxing America. So Lord North wasn't messing around. Hey, we can get rid of this tax. That's fine. Not if they think that we're actually getting rid of the power to tax, because for the rest of my life, that's what I'm pushing for, the power to tax the people. Now, the American Revolutionaries, they knew this whole thing was a trap. This was pretty obvious to them. They understood, as John Dickinson wrote when the Townshend Acts were first passed in 1767, that this would just be a precedent for more in the future. Again, this is a trifling sum, and he understood that, well, why the heck would they even have such a small duty, such a small tax, if they weren't using it to establish a precedent for future use? And that's exactly how he put it. He said the authors of this law would never have obtained an act to raise so trifling a sum as it must do, had they not intended by it to establish a precedent for future use. And then he hammered it home with this: to console ourselves with the smallness of the duties is to walk deliberately into the snare that is set for us, praising the neatness of the workmanship. And that really is the case. They knew it's a trap. And that's exactly how Mercy Otis Warren described it later on in her great History of the American Revolution. She said this inconsiderable duty, again, they all understood that the duty itself was tiny. So why would they be fighting over a small financial amount? It wasn't that, it was the principle. This inconsiderable duty on teas finally became an object of high importance and altercation. It was not the sum, she wrote, but the principle that was contested. It manifestly appeared that this was only a financiering expedient to raise a revenue from the colonies by imperceptible taxes, step by step, precedent by precedent. Expanding power and control is what government does. John Dickinson understood it. Mercy Otis Warren understood it. Even Alexander Hamilton. He probably learned the wrong way on that later on, but I wanted to point out here as well that I know I'm citing a bunch of original source documents, plus I have that episode on the Declaratory Act. That'll all be linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. We publish a blog post for every single episode, and Alan Mosley does an incredible job getting that organized every week or every episode pretty quickly after I get wrapped up with the live stream. And in each blog post, you're going to find a show link section that generally has the stuff that I'm mentioning in the show in the order that I go through it. So Alan will get that organized. I will get it published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. A couple of hours after this live stream is done. But let's get back to this again. So we're talking about how Parliament is using the Tea Act of 1773 as kind of a way to manipulate the people in the colonies. They were only willing to change the regulations and the rules on how things played out when they realized they couldn't collect all the money that they wanted to collect, when they realized that the people were just going to find ways to be non-compliant. So they had this scheme to kind of buy them off. We'll lower the price of the tea through this change, and then they will voluntarily submit to the taxes that they claim that they would never submit to. Parliament didn't just want the tea sold. They weren't just interested in saving the East India Company. They really wanted the tax quietly swallowed along with it. And that's exactly how Benjamin Franklin explained their strategy in a letter to Thomas Cushing. This is June 4th, 1773. Of course, it'll be linked to in the show notes. He said, but now the scheme is to take off as much duty here as will make tea cheaper in America than foreigners can supply us. So the legal tea, it was definitely going to be cheaper, and probably most of the smuggled tea as well. And what would happen, Franklin said, and continue the duty there to keep up the exercise of the right. Now, when they're talking about the right in this context, whether it's Franklin or anyone else, they're all referencing the Declaratory Act. This was the right that they claimed to implement whatever power, policies, taxes, anything over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So they tried to make it about price, but as George Washington also understood in a letter to Brian Fairfax, that it was really about the power. He said, for sir, what is it that we are contending against? Is it against paying the duty on tea because it's burdensome? Wow, that is a tough word for me. He said, no, it is the right only. We have all along disputed. And in case anyone thought that an entire continent could be bought off by a cheaper cup of tea, Benjamin Franklin set them straight. He said they have no idea that any people can act from any principle but that of interest. And they believe that 3 pence in a pound of tea, of which one does not drink perhaps 10 pounds in a year, is sufficient to overcome all the patriotism of an American. But of all people that I have read and researched on this particular topic, maybe a bit of a surprise to me when I first found it, no one really hit it harder than Alexander Hamilton, a young, fiery revolutionary. First, he made the British argument here. The British argument was this: our contest with Britain is founded entirely upon the petty duty of 3 pence per pound on East India tea. But he didn't just reject that excuse, he totally buried it. He said, whereas the whole world knows it is built upon this interesting question, whether the inhabitants of Great Britain have a right to dispose of the lives and properties of the inhabitants of America or not. And when news hit the colonies that tea shipments were on the way, the people didn't beg for permission. They didn't have some soft protests or petitions. They drew a hard line. They actually named their enemy. Like these resolutions passed unanimously for the town of Boston, drafted, I believe, by Samuel Adams. Whoever shall directly or indirectly countenance this attempt, or in any wise aid or abet in unloading, receiving, or vending the tea sent, or to be sent out by the East India Company, while it remains subject to the payment of a duty here, is an enemy to America. I mean, that is not holding back at all. Directly or indirectly, supporting or effectuating the Tea Act made you an enemy to America. And Benjamin Rush also totally understood that the real cost was going to be liberty, not just 3 pence per pound. And he was talking about the tea as it was on its way. Should it be landed? It is to be feared it will find its way amongst us. Then, farewell American liberty. We are undone forever. And so he said, we have to oppose the landing of the tea. He said, the baneful chests contain in them a slow poison in a political as well as a physical sense. They contain something worse than death, the seeds of slavery. Now back to Hamilton. Before he fully lit them up, he first gave them a calm reminder of what this was and actually what this wasn't. He said, we neither desire nor endeavor to threaten, bully, or frighten any persons into a compliance with our demands. We have no peevish and petulant humors to be submitted to. Then the gloves came off and he started swinging with this. All we aim at is to convince your high and mighty masters, the ministry, that we are not such asses as to let them ride us as they please. This was no petition. I mean, really, when you get down to it, it was a warning. And he summed it up with this. We are determined to show them that we know the value of freedom, nor shall their rapacity extort that inestimable jewel from us without a manly and virtuous struggle. The rest, as the old saying goes, is history. And the government-run and government-approved education system never seems to teach anyone that the American Revolution was really all about opposition to centralized power. And that's a big part of the reason why we work so hard every single day to reach and teach more and more people with this truth, with this real history. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that quickly devaluing, dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Whatever you choose is awesome. And if you don't even want to be a member, but you still want to support us, there's a number of ways you can do it. If you want to do it financially and make a one-time gift, or if you already are a member and want to pitch in more, thank you. No pressure on any of this at all. But I want to make sure you have the URL so you can do that if you want to. 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate to make a one-time contribution to support our work. Of course, there's a bunch of free and easy-peasy things you can do as well. Hitting the like button, reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments in the archive, sharing the links, and on video platforms like the mainstream ones. Watch time percentage is a huge part of the algorithm. So if it's a 10-minute video and you watch 12 minutes of it, you watch the first 2 minutes over again, that's 120%, and that helps out a great deal. So I really appreciate your support, whether financial, otherwise, combination. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it was interesting. I hope it was entertaining here and there. But more important than anything, I hope it made you think. And I hope you learned something. I hope you have an awesome weekend. I'm really glad that you stayed around till the end. Have a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.